And stop your choice, by the way, how you feel today.
We've been on this road to a place that one day we'll know. Adventure to the other side. Searching high and low for the treasure deep in your soul. The fortune teller's always right. Got them red eyes in the night, like a panther out of sight. Gonna sing my battle cry, 'cause I am the hunter, I am the hunter, I am the great unknown. Only my love can conquer.
Let's wait for one more minute, then we can. Welcome everyone. It's good to see you. I think we can move forward and then I can close this poll. Yeah. So, welcome everyone. Today we have Elvin, and he will be introducing us to cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So, Elvin, welcome, and would you like to introduce yourself and the session?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elvin Fortuna. Thanks to Damla and the L&D Shakers for putting this on. And I'll be doing an introduction, very much an introduction to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And I'm hoping everyone gets a little bit of something, or learn something new during the session. So thanks for having me.
Great, and let me start the presentation.
Perfect. Yeah, Damla, you okay if I get started?
Sure.
All right. So like I said, we'll be talking about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Before I start, I just want to give a quick introduction about me, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from, and then we can kind of have a conversation about these things. So I have three graphics there, right? So on the left, you see the Michigan State University logo. I'm a doctoral student in my second year at Michigan State University, where I do educational psychology and educational technology. In the center, you'll see the Army University logo. So I'm a U.S. Army officer at the rank of major. I actually do logistics. Long story, I could tell you later. But right now, I do instructional design for the United States military, and I kind of do both at the same time. So it's a little busy for me, but that's what I do. And just full disclosure, I'm not talking on behalf of the Department of Defense or any military organization. This is just me talking in my own free time to you about something that I'm passionate about. And then the third is a Kansas City Chiefs logo. If you're not into American football, it means nothing to you. Don't worry about it. If you are, just know I live in Kansas, and that's my team. So 3 short things about me so you can kind of understand what I do. I mostly focus on how experts learn using multimedia, but I do understand a lot of the foundations about multimedia learning for novices as well. So before we get started, I just want to get an idea. You can put it in the chat or react. Who has heard of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning? And then if you have you used it? Do you understand it? Or what misconceptions? We'll just take about a minute. Let's go ahead and put your reactions in the chat. Okay, just read about it. Haven't heard about it yet. New to L&D, awesome, welcome. Okay, okay, okay. Use, understand, and have written about it. All right, Sarah. If I mess up, you let me know. Otherwise, we'll talk about some specifics. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we have mostly individuals that haven't heard about the theory, some people that may have read about it, and then some that have a deeper understanding. So I'm going to tailor it more towards an introductory level. And if you have specific questions to do Q&A, we'll do about 30 minutes, talk about the theory. There's a lot of me talking. I'll ask you some questions, and then we'll go into Q&A. And then if any examples, or if you want to bring up any of your own projects, happy to talk about it. Okay, so just a little bit about the theory. So on the left, you'll see that's Dr. Richard Mayer. So I don't pretend to say that this is my work. I'm explaining a great scientist's work on his behalf. But I've read pretty much everything that he's published regarding multimedia learning, at least the third edition of it, that considers what is the core evidence, which is about 80-ish studies that he considers core evidence for the theory. But that's the guy. He's been doing this from UC Santa Barbara since about the 1980s. And he's published 3 editions of that center book, which is called Multimedia Learning. And if you can either have the money or your company is willing to pay for it, I would definitely recommend you get a copy of this book. It's Mayer's take on the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. It's very well explained. He goes through the foundations and he goes through each of the 15 principles that he advocates for. Now, the one on the right is if you're a little bit more technical or have a research interest. It's a thicker book. It's the Cambridge Handbook of Multimedia Learning, and it's a little pricier. Multimedia Learning, the smaller book's going to be about like $50-$60. You can get an e-version of it. The Cambridge Handbook is a couple $100, but it's the definitive evidence-based handbook that Mayer is an editor for and wrote some chapters for too, but there's a lot more. And here's one thing I would like for everyone to understand before I go to the rest of it. A lot of times when you go on LinkedIn, a lot of times when you go do a Google search, different things pop up. Not everything is as true as you may think. And for example, you go on Google, you Google Mayer's theory of multimedia learning, you get 12 principles. Okay, you might see an older one with 7. The most current has 15. And if you were to ask me how many principles of multimedia learning there are, I would tell you we don't know that yet, technically. We know Mayer advocates for 15. The Multimedia Learning Handbook has like over 25, I believe. And then the research community is still figuring this out. Like, this isn't something that everyone understands just yet. That's why there are multiple editions. And I wouldn't be surprised if there'd be something new. So just don't be afraid to be critical and to think through what you're seeing when it comes to learning science. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to explain this, and then we'll get into specific principles. But this is probably the best graphic that exists as far as understanding the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And really, it's a multiple theories integrated with each other that explain how Richard Mayer posits that learning works. This is how we think the brain works, right? And ultimately, what he's saying is because of this, we learn better with words and pictures. That's the big point. If you read, you can learn something. If you see a photo, you can see something. But the two together give you some effect for learning that is better than either or alone. And how does this work? Well, you have to look at this diagram from the left to the right. All right, so on the left, you see, let me annotate it real quick, this, multimedia presentation, right? So that is the actual object that you're looking at, right? The e-learning that you create. Whatever media format you use, whatever tool, doesn't matter. It could be a textbook chapter, words and pictures. What happens is you get to this sensory memory part. That sensory memory part is seconds or less. It's the immediate impression that your physical senses get of those words and pictures, right? So what goes through the ears, what goes through the eyes, that's stored in sensory memory for like a few seconds. What happens here is something very important. So out of all the things that you have experienced, you go through a selection process where you pay attention to certain things and you filter and only a select amount of that information actually makes it to your working memory, right? And so this process here of filtering and selection is super important. There are principles that derive from that. So it moves from your sensory memory into your working memory. Think of your working memory as like a workshop table, right? This is where your brain starts making connections, you know? And so what'll happen is you organize those sounds, those images into models. And your brain makes a verbal model, which has your, like your words, your narration, and it forms a pictorial model, which has all the visual elements spatially correlated. And then here, you integrate the verbal and the pictorial information together. And those connections make a fuller model that would have been possible without the integration of both words and pictures. And then you get long-term memory. It's encoded into your long-term memory, and you connect that integrated model into your prior knowledge. And that's how it gets stored for the long term. And so this is what it's called the information model. This is how Mary thinks it works. This is what happens when you see your e-learning. And these are the processes happening. You select words and images, you organize them into models, and you integrate them into a model that's full, which you encode, right? So there's a lot more to it, but there's two channels, right? There's the words, and then there's the images, and different things are happening here. Now, one thing to note is over here in these double arrows, right? You can have words that are visually shown, and you can have words that are shown through narration. And so your brain actually has to separate those two things. And there's some principles that deal with that, particularly redundancy, which we'll talk about a little later. But you have to make a choice as to whether you want how much narration or how much text you have in your e-learning, and it will have an effect. Now, what's something to note about this model that I think is key is it's about learning. It's not about anything else. It's not about motivation, aesthetics, liking, experience. All Mayor cares about is whether you learn something. And so it can't explain everything. So we talk about learning, and you have, I call this learning outcomes, and this is from a table in his book, but there's really three things, right? So obviously you can have no learning. You don't learn anything. And so your retention and your transfer are poor. Let me clarify this term right here and this term. Retention is sort of those easier metrics, right? What do you remember? What can you recall? If you use Bloom's taxonomy, you're talking about remembering, right? That's great, but transfer is what we care about. Transfer is the ability to take what you have learned and use it in other situations. And this, to me, is the point of learning, at least, is to be able to use it in similar and dissimilar situations. And so rote learning, which is, I would say, the majority of your e-learning falls, your corporate training, like it's multiple choice quizzes, like some standard passive learning experience. You get retention, so it's going. You're processing the information, but you're not making any connections that are really valuable, and so your retention is high, but your transfer is poor. You don't know how to use that in different situations. What you want to get to is what Mayer calls as meaningful learning. Meaningful learning being that I can both retain the information and I understand it enough where I can use it in similar and dissimilar situations, right? And so what Mayer is measuring is meaningful learning. Can I use the information in different situations? So I'll switch gears a little bit, and then we'll talk about cognitive capacity, because this is sort of important to understand as well. And this is really Mayer's interpretation of cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory, for those that haven't heard about it, think of your brain as having 100% a fixed amount of capacity, right? You have 100%, right? And anytime you use that processing power towards something, you're taking away from what's left and available, right? And so in this pie chart, I'm assuming there's a fixed amount of capacity, right? And you have three types of things. You have extraneous load. So these are things that are unnecessary for you to learn what you need to learn. It's in red because we don't want that, right? We want, if it's distracting to learning, it's taking away from the processing I need to actually be able to learn something. Then you have this essential processing. The essential processing, intrinsic load, depending on what frame you use, has to deal with the learning task itself. So to give you a good example, if I need to learn how to, you know, if I do a class that teaches me what's the difference between the color blue and the color red, that's low intrinsic load. That's like one screen. I show the difference. You can tell me that you know the difference. You did it. Learning how the lung works in air constrained situations in space, that's complex. And so that takes more processing power to try to learn something like that. It's 50 slides. You have videos and narrations because like it's a lot of things to do. You There are ways to manage this, but you can't eliminate it, right? And then generative processing is always a little confusing, but generative processing is um, extra work you put in to make more connections. And if you have the processing available, that's what you use it for. So you want a lot of this, you want to manage this, and you want to get rid of this. And I have a couple other slides that'll break that down. So and this is a figure for mayor, I just kind of redid. There are three common scenarios in learning that, that your class that you probably deal with probably falls under one of these. And keep in mind that when we talk about cognitive capacity, we're talking about the individual learner's capacity, right? So the cognitive capacity for one learner may be different than another. But the first one is extraneous overload. So this is a situation where you have a whole lot of extra stuff in your course. You got a video, some images that show something unrelated. You got, like your colors are all out of match, and there's just a lot going on. And so you've put say 33% of the learner's capacity is dealt with just processing this extra stuff. Whatever they have left is used to try to understand the learning goal, but there's not enough left. You have all this left that there's just not enough, capacity left to process, and they never really start to make the connections they need. There's a gap, and you never get to that. There's essential overload. So, okay, we're a little better now. So we got rid of everything that's extraneous, but what you're teaching is really hard, right? And so the learner's doing the best they can, but you didn't do anything to make it easier for the learner to process it. And so they still never get to fully understand the content, and they never start to make the connections. And then you have generative underutilization, opposite situation. Your class is really easy. So they are kind of bored and they have more to give, but you didn't make enough of this to kind of engage the learner more and make more connections, right? So those are three scenarios that I thought were pretty interesting and kind of put cognitive load theory in a better frame. So we talked about this, three types of load, and there are three strategies, right? So if you have extraneous load, you want to reduce those things, right? So any extra graphics, irrelevant, seductive details, things like that. If you have essential material that you have to teach, you need to figure out how to manage it better, how to segment it, how to arrange it to make the learner use less capacity on trying to figure out what you're doing and more towards making those necessary connections. And then with generative load, so with extra cognitive capacity you have left, if you have it, and we want to, then you want to foster the activities to help the learner make even more connections and more deeply ingrained that information. So there are 15 principles. I don't have 10 hours. I have about another 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go through all 15. But I want you to get a sense of Mayer's 15 principles, and then we'll do a couple examples and think through them to kind of, for you to understand kind of how this works. So principles for reducing extraneous processing. What Mayer is talking about are principles that make the learning easier for the learner and get rid of things they don't need. So like coherence and signaling. Signaling specifically, pointing to somehow verbally or visually the part of your e-learning that is most significant. Redundancy, not having to have both narration and text simultaneously playing because one of those channels is good enough. And in fact, Mayer says really it's just narration plus the visuals with minimal to no text. And then spatial contiguity and temporal contiguity, putting the relevant parts of the text near the relevant parts of the visuals and reducing the space between the two, and then talking about them simultaneously versus in sequence. Principles for managing essential processing are principles that you can make your hard material easier to understand. So segmenting, giving the learner chances to pause at routine intervals so they can kind of take stock, think through what they're learning and make those connections. Pre-training, for example, would be giving the learner some kind of read ahead materials that are very relevant to the course so that when they enter the course, they have more capacity to engage. And then fostering principles for fostering generative processing. These are, like voice principle, like having the learner speak in a natural voice using first person versus third person actually improves learning outcomes. There's a lot more. There's a lot more. I'd love to do more series like these on these principles, but I refer you to the book for more specifics or in the Q&A. So the biggest principle, and it might seem obvious to everyone here, is the multimedia principle. But there's actually been a lot of research on this. And the question becomes, do you learn better with words and pictures, right? Like you as an instructional designer, why are you doing all this work? And the fact is, and I'll just read the quote, people do learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. How do we know that? There are 13 experimental studies. There's more than 13. It's just these are the 13 Mayer chose, where learners using words and pictures outperformed other experimental conditions that either had text or narrations. And the effect size is like 1.35, which is humongous. Like in research circles, like low is 0.2, like large is 0.8. Like I've never seen anything over 1. So, and he says the effect size deals with transfer, as in people learning with multimedia are able to use those concepts in different situations, which I think is humongous. And so this may seem like something obvious to you, but it's something that had to be proved. And I would say it's proved relatively well. So the next 3 screens, we'll just take about like 5 minutes and go through these, is I just took one of the principles from each kind of category. And I wanted to kind of just engage you and just ask you some questions and give you a sense of how you would actually use this. Because a lot of times theory seems a little divorced from practice. And I think it's useful to go through some exercise like this. So here we have a study where Lee, Wang, and Mayer and Liu made an e-learning on signaling. They were testing signaling, and they have 4 groups. And so in one of these groups, well, the signaling process principle states that pointing to the most relevant part of the graphic or pointing to the graphic or using the graphic somehow is better than not. So I want you to look at these 4 conditions and just let me know, say this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is 4. Forget my handwriting. Which of these 4 you think did the learner learn the best? Okay, pretty straightforward. Yep, you guys are on it. Yep. So there's an effect. This is with the pedagogical agent, but the learner pointing to the point of the graphic makes sense. And what I found interesting is that the contact with the learner was irrelevant, right? Like it didn't matter if this learner was looking at the screen. It didn't even matter the qualities of the learner per se. It's just this right here. And this was a visual one, but it's been replicated with verbal signals as well, is important. So that's It doesn't have to look amazing. Maybe it does for you to sell your course. Maybe it does for you to get interest. But for learning, I mean, that's it. Okay, so let's go through this one. So I won't explain the principle, but here you have two things. On this screen, the content shows up all at once. So it's one screen, all that shows up in narration. On this screen, things build. On which of these two screens do you believe the learner learned best? Let's say 1 and 2. Yep. Cognitive overload on the first one. Right. Yep. That what I like about these principles is most of them are pretty intuitive. Some of them aren't. Like I picked some easy ones here, but the segmenting principle really states that you present in chunks, and then you give the learner pause. So often with progression slides tend to get a little cramped towards the end. Yes, yes. Um, I wouldn't even, and I agree with you, Kelisa. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Like I would have the build, but I wouldn't even leave the material there. This some background on this study. This was actually a PowerPoint build. Um, you could even do better and not even just have that build and then disappear and then use that space better. More of a design issue. Um, I would expect that you would see better outcomes if you didn't even leave the previous material there. But that wasn't tested. This was just like 16 slides on PowerPoint. But yeah, that's how the segmenting principle works. Pretty straightforward, violated all the time. Okay, and this one doesn't have any graphics. Let me see if we get to Matt's comment. Is the overload caused by the high volume leading to the excessive cognitive load problem, regardless of how good the image is? Great question. Let me get back to that. So the cognitive overload is both visual and textual, right? Um, one way the complexity of something is measured is by element interactivity. And so researchers will count literally how many words, images, actions there are on a screen. And the higher amount of them, the more complex or like content there is. And then you want to just reduce the amount of elements. And so cognitive overload would be caused by the amount of text, the amount of images, and then by quality of images, I would say whether the learner has to actually put more work into deciphering it. So if it's a bad image in the sense of it's not understandable or decipherable, then yes. Now, if it's a bad image, like I don't like how it looks, less so of an effect. But blurry, nonsensical, cramped, and the learner has to think more to try to figure it out. Yeah. Yep. Got it. Yep. Big problem for neurodiverse people. I'd 100% agree. And to me, it's a win just because if you can make it easier for neurodiverse populations and make it easier for the rest of your learners, it's a double win. Why not just do it easier? So we'll do this one real quick. So this one's the personalization principle. So just take a second, read the left, and then read the right, and then let me know in which of these two conditions do you think the learner learned best? Okay, we see two. Two. Yep. Yeah, you guys are on it. Yep, more personalized. Personalization principle states literally that just changing the wording to a personalized thing isn't just about like feeling good or something. Like it's not like some fuzzy. It's like you actually make better connections and retain the material more. And there's a lot of theorized versions of it. The way I've sort of kind of interpreted it is you know your own body. So when people talk to you and refer to yourself, you have more attention to that, and you actually can make more connections to like, oh, my diaphragm, my lungs, my nose, my mouth. It's not something that's so divorced. Accessible design and UX. Um, yeah, great comment, Nikki. Great comment. Yep, definitely agree. Yep. So those are small things. Those aren't like huge, costly changes you need to make to your e-learning. These are just like simple tweaks that are evidence based, and those are just 3 out of the 15, and very short examples of the 3 out of the 15. I would just get a copy of the book, read through it, and then see what works. Now, I ended this with some boundaries or boundary conditions because we have a tendency outside of research circles to overgeneralize. And so there's a couple of things to be wary about. So when we're talking about this cognitive theory multimedia learning, we're talking about learning, transfer, some retention, mostly transfer. This doesn't tell you anything about whether the learner enjoys anything. The learner could be miserable through the entire experience and still learn something. We don't want them to, obviously. It's not a UX framework. Um, it doesn't tell you whether your course is going to be well accepted by your client. It just tells you whether the learner is going to learn something, which is to me is really important, but it may not be the only factor that you're dealing with. For example, like logos. A logo does nothing for learning. A logo may be necessary for you to even get the project accepted by the client. You may have to make that adjustment. Second, it deals with scientific explanations. So the type of things that Mayer is testing and is really has to do with how a scientific concept or process or fact works. For example, a lot of the studies deal with a 30-second intervention on how lightning forms. You know, a lot of the studies have to do with like how the plants grow. You know, how does a bike pump operate? How does a brake system or cylinders work in an automobile? This doesn't deal so much with like fuzzier things in the affective domain, right? So think of ethics. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning will tell you this is how someone will memorize ethics. It won't tell you this is how someone becomes ethical. You know, that's something ultimately very different. And it may not deal so well with, you know, things that are thematic or complex. Um, it has to deal with very simple things. And that goes to the third point, which is this has been tested on novice learners. Over 90% of the studies in the core evidence are with undergraduates at the University of California at Santa Barbara. The other 10% are like high schoolers, so middle schoolers, not a lot of adult learners, and not a lot of complex materials. And so if someone were to tell me, I need an e-learning course on, how does the supply system work at my company? Like how does this procedure work? Got it. Cognitive theory, multimedia learning, do A, B, C, D, E, whatever. But if you're doing something like, hey, teach me how to do, let's say, a business strategy for a complex scenario because the environmental situations are changing, and I need to know how to flex my leadership towards getting better, revenues in the fourth quarter based off of the ever-changing economic situation in like the European states. It doesn't speak to that as well. Like the things that this theory was founded on were like a minute, 2 minute, 3 minute. When you get to like a week's worth of content and like graduate level work, maybe not so much. And I see the comments. I'm going to get to them in a second. And then it's a cognitive theory multimedia learning. Like it's about whether you know the information and can use it. It doesn't change, may not necessarily change behavior, which sometimes people care about. Like it's not just that you know how to, like use the system, but we want to see you actually apply it and use it in your workplace. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say much about that. Okay, I've done enough talking. Damon, I think, should I just start getting to the comments?
Yeah, sure. Then we can start Q&A time. Right. Yeah.
Perfect.
If you have questions, you can ask them to him right now.
Yep, I'm looking at Nikki's comment right now. So, yep, this confounding. There's always been a confounding between. Um, I do this in my military work a lot with leaders, where they say, "Well, my learners don't like my course," and then I give them like, "Well, here's 10, 5,000 samples. We did an independent samples t-test of the two means, and there's a statistically significant difference improvement in people learning. So there's a discrepancy between the interest in learning, and I think it's good for us as designers to be able to speak to both, because there are two different strategies to address them. If it was a learning gap, this works. If it's an interest gap, Nikki's on it, but it doesn't work so much. So thanks for that comment, Nikki. Um, got it. Okay, Lisa, go ahead.
Hi there. Good evening from New Delhi in India. Thank you so much for conducting this. This was super helpful. I had a quick question, please. And my question is to do with so I understand that a lot of Maya's work, or at least the context within which this has currently been put, is in e learning, right? Any views on, you know, um, I think constructing learning, particularly for, let's say, VILTs, right? Because with a VILT, you've got, dare I use the term, I mean, at least one form of media, which is typically you've got PowerPoint slides, and within that, you've got progression by virtue of animation, right? But what also typically tends to happen is there's this other sort of, dare I use the term, loose cannon element, which is the facilitator. And there's also, of course, technology and the user interface in general. So, any sort of thoughts on how learning designers could also look at designing virtual classroom experiences, keeping in mind certain tenets of minimizing cognitive overload during a VLT session. Sorry, I hope my question was, I hope that made sense. Or if it didn't, please let me know.
No, it makes perfect sense. It's just, can you clarify one thing? What is a VILD?
Oh, I'm so sorry. A VILT is like, for example, exactly what you're doing right now. It's like a virtual classroom session, right? So typically you'd be on a platform, and then there would be, there's a facilitator, and a facilitator would, let's say, have a slide deck. Sometimes there would be other platforms like a Mentimeter, or quizzes, or where you've also got these little interactive elements happening. And I just kind of wonder, because sometimes I feel like the decks are great when people make the decks, but as you were also talking about, like, visuals, and I mean, so pictures and words, and pictures and words, but then there's also this additional element of like the audio, um, or a facilitator's narrative, right? And sometimes I just feel like I mean, personally, when I design, or my experience has been when PowerPoint presentations are designed, sometimes we tend to forget that there is also going to be this additional third piece that's going to come into the scheme of things, which is the facilitator, right? And I'm just wondering, I mean, it's just been my experience where sometimes it all feels like a bit too much. The images plus the text, so, and then there's, of course, a person speaking as well. Yeah.
That's really interesting because it helps me. There are things that the cognitive theory of multimedia learning can tell you about it, and some things that it can't. So when it comes to the human factor, it is not informative at all regarding that. Um, like, you could have all these principles set up, but then the human instructor and their pedagogies, there are other theories to deal with that, as far as like, like the sequence of learning activities or how that should go. Regarding the multimedia aspect, there's really two frames. If you look at it from a cognitive load theory frame, then what you would want to do is really take a hard look at your interface, your platform, and the actual multimedia content being sent. We'll say it's a PowerPoint slide, and an instructor. We'll take a look at the PowerPoint slide, take a look at the platform you're using, and say, like, what is necessary, what is distracting, and then the question always to ask is, what is the most important thing that the learner needs to take away at this given moment? And then focus it on that, and then get rid of as much as you can that makes sense. The rest, or minimize it, or make it not distracting. And the cognitive theory of multimedia learning will tell you much about um, how the picture should play with the script of the instructor is saying. Now, that theory was made based off of no human interaction, right? So it has everything to do with like an e-learning course that's asynchronous, or someone doing a PowerPoint slide that's automated narrated, or even virtual environments, but in none of the conditions was there a human facilitator. So you got to kind of think through a different set of problems, which that's a more realistic answer than telling you like this is going to make solve all your problems. It's not. It'll only serve a certain aspect of it, the design and the materials. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, it was. Thank you very much.
Of course. Okay. I see some on the text, and I think there's someone waiting. So I'll get to Kendra's point real quick. So the narration on-screen text issue. Um, you mostly have it correct. Let me get a copy of my book real quick because I want to make sure I get this one exactly right. This this is one of my favorite ones to actually talk about because it can confound people. So let's see. Redundancy principle, signaling. Let's see. Going to read this almost direct. Yep. So I'm going to read this. So redundancy principle. So people do not learn better from when printed text is added to graphics and narration. People learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and printed text when the lesson is fast-paced. End quote. So I'll give you the short version of it, and then I really you should probably read chapter 8 on this book. But when you have textual information or words, and they come through both the ears and the eyes simultaneously, say it's the same script, right? The learner is doing double work. The learner is, whether they know it or not, they're reading the exact same text that they're receiving in audio format, and then a process mentally happens where the learner has to deconflict the two. And if there's a difference between your narration and the text on screen, that's even more work because the learner has to determine which of the two to prioritize. And so Mayer doesn't say never use text on your screen. What he really is saying is don't have your entire narrative script also just be on the screen. And then the text that is augments the visual piece. All right, take care, Bernadette. If you have any questions, email me. It's on the last slide, or check your LinkedIn. Thanks for coming. What Mayer is really saying is the text that is on the screen should serve for signaling purposes, right, or a specific purpose. And you shouldn't just copy and paste your narration. They serve two different things because the learner is simultaneously looking at your images and taking the narration and painting a picture. You don't want that text to like interfere with it. So, Oren, I think you're going to ask about, first let me, yep. So I think Kendra, did I answer your question? Awesome. Yep. And feel free to contact me if you want to talk more about it. Matt, I think you asked about bulleted lists. Does the sequencing apply where you should build them in one at a time and direct people to the? Yes. It doesn't necessarily need to be a build. Like that can work too, depending on. It just depends on specifically what you're doing, right? Like if the list is coherent and the learner needs to understand the list in its entirety because they're a part of one concept, then of course bullet, 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 bullet. And then let the learner chew over each one of them. If the list is a list of unrelated things and it's just listed for no reason, you might want to segment that out and let the learner process those on their own time. So it's context dependent, is what I would say. But if you can make it easier, make it easier. I think Anne Do I have more examples of selection of words? Also use of quotes, etc. Um, Interesting question. So if I understand Mayor correctly, the way he would answer that question is that quote a seductive detail? What I mean is, and he defines seductive details as something that on paper looks useful, but upon further analysis doesn't have a direct link to what you're learning. And this has nothing to do with ethics. So maybe you want to keep it for other reasons, but for learning, if I could take your performance assessment at the end and that material was not necessary, then it wasn't necessary, which is a very stark way of looking at things. Um, but from a learning perspective, you have just used more cognitive capacity to process a quote or something, that's motivational. And I may have been better off using that for the direct learning task for learning purposes. I don't want to take away from that because you may need it for other reasons, right? Like to keep the learner from not logging off, maybe. Um, but yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Anne. Of course. Okay, I think Oren, you had a question, and I think you had your mic up. So you want to just say your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, cool. So first of all, thanks for the presentation. It was very informative, and I have like a million different questions. Some of which you already answered with the text and narration. Like sometimes I have this endless discussions with clients about e-learning. We have narration? Shouldn't we have, like, should they compete with one another? And like I always try to advocate against text and narration altogether because they're competing, and it's good to have some science-backed ammunition in these situations. I'm curious about how these research was conducted in terms of like all else being equal. Like, did they measure the content versus like in what context? Like, is it like was out of context? Let's learn about how bicycle works, or I need to fix a bicycle, and now let's learn about these things. So like the inherent motivation of the learner, storytelling, all these kinds of things that we are, intuitively, I guess, put into our learning design. Are these things measured, or is it like just plainly measuring, all these technical aspects? So I'm curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to attempt in about a 30 to 45 seconds to explain what a typical experiment would look like. And this is mostly from the 80s, 90s, but there's a lot in the last 20 years as well. But the basics of it are the same. And so, and this kind of goes to your question, what is multimedia? To Mayer is kind of ironic, but it's a media agnostic theory. And I have this debate all the time with some of my colleagues, but just it says the word multimedia, but it doesn't matter to Mayer whether it's like a chapter book, a VR simulation, or an e-learning course, or a PowerPoint slide, or like, it doesn't matter. Like if there are words and pictures, he says, then he's in that cognitive theory of multimedia learning space. The typical experiment will look like this. Let's say he has his lab at UC Santa Barbara. He develops a maybe 16 frame learning, and it'll be like lightning formation is one that he always uses. So it'll be like ions form in the sky, narration plus a video, like a black and white depiction of like ions in the sky. Then it's like the ions start, I don't know, forming somehow in the cloud. Click, and then step by step by step. no introduction, no conclusion, no like tie to the learner's like affect or prior learning. It's just like bam, here's how lightning forms, 16 screens, narration plus very basic 2D uh, you know, visual. Okay. Then he asked them retention questions. So, like what components are involved in lightning formation? Like what are the conditions needed for lightning to form? Then he asked transfer questions. So if I were to change, the length of, like atmospheric conditions or something, would lightning form in this situation? If I have X, Y, and Z, and I change this part of the process, will lightning form in the same way? Kind of more advanced questions, and then he measures them. And so all the things, Lauren, that you're talking about, like, did you um, set conditions for whether the learner cares about the content? Did you, all of that, like he doesn't speak to it. And so in a lot of ways, it's a very limited theory that's very powerful for that. Okay, Lisa, thanks for coming. Yep, and yep, contact me if you have any questions after this. But it doesn't speak to a lot of it. Now, very specific pieces like this whole narration texting, he's very clear about. And so, if you get a copy of the book and go to chapter 8 and you want to have that conversation about narration and text together, you have ammunition all day. But when it comes to like
Yeah.
some of the design type things, not so much. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. It's I mean, it strikes me as, is a classic academia professor that is really kind of into theory and it's, I don't know how much it applies really like to the everyday learners. I mean, if you want to kind of study how learners actually learn, you go to TikTok, you go to YouTube or something like that. I mean, I'm not sure in the lab is that practical, but I don't know, maybe this is like my critical thinking and stuff, but yeah, it is answered my question, and thank you for that.
Of course,
Thanks
Lauren.
everyone
And you're
for
not wrong.
thanks everyone for your contribution, and thank you so much, Elvin, for answering all the questions. And if you want to connect with Elvin and ask him your questions, you can. And also, as a classic, I want to know what did you learn today, and I would be happy if you could write it. Thank you, everyone. Choice.